A single forbidden step could erase her entire future. Elara, a young scholar of Varda, moves in total silence through the darkened forbidden archive. She believes the lost texts hidden here hold a history of the Valar that the ruling Conclave has deliberately erased. Her entire world believes the Valar were perfect, distant gods, but she seeks a single scroll rumored to tell a different story, one of flawed beings and forgotten choices. If she is caught, the punishment is not just exile, but the complete obliteration of her name from all records. By the end of this tale, you will discover how a single hidden truth can shatter a world's foundation and rewrite everything we think we know about divinity itself. What secrets could be so dangerous that they must be buried forever? Wherever you are in the world right now, and whatever the hour, I would love to know what place you are listening from. What would you risk to learn a truth that could change everything? The brittle parchment crackles under her touch, a sound like breaking bones in the oppressive silence. As Elara unrolls the scroll, a script of faint, silver light ignites across its surface, pulsing with a soft, inherent magic. This is it. The glow is the ancient seal of authenticity she was told to seek, a confirmation that the knowledge in her hands is real and perilously potent. For a single, breathless moment, triumph floods her. Then, the light shifts, casting long, dancing shadows that stretch like accusing fingers across the distant archive walls. A heavy footstep echoes in response, followed by the low, resonant hum of a warden's sensing staff. The light has betrayed her. Her heart hammers against her ribs as she frantically re-rolls the text, the silvery script searing her vision. Her planned route to the ventilation shaft is now a death trap, the wardens already converging there. With no time to think, she turns and plunges deeper into the archive's heart, into sections so old and forbidden, even the Conclave's maps are blank. The stakes are no longer about stealing a secret. They are now about surviving the truth she carries. Every rustle of her cloak, every frantic breath, feels deafening in the dark. What terrible price did the Valar pay to have their earliest history guarded with such lethal intent? Her breath hitched as the warden's heavy footfalls closed in, the hum of its staff vibrating through the stone floor. A towering bookcase, its wood rotted and splintered, stood between her and certain capture. With no other option, she threw her shoulder against it, the ancient structure groaning in protest before collapsing inward in a cloud of dust and decay. Instead of solid wall, she tumbled through the newly revealed opening, the bookcase crashing down behind her and sealing the passage with a final, thunderous boom. The sound of the wardens was instantly muffled, replaced by an eerie, profound silence. Her escape was a success, but it came at a terrible cost. She was now entombed within the archive's forgotten veins, cut off from the world she knew. The air here was different, thick with the scent of petrified leather and ages of undisturbed dust, and the archive itself seemed to resent her intrusion. The corridor ahead was no longer a straight path of orderly shelves, but a twisting, organic-looking tunnel of leaning stone and warped, woven wood. As she took a tentative step forward, the wall to her right seemed to sigh and subtly shift, the outline of a doorway she had just noticed now blurring into solid rock. This was no mere repository of books. It was a living, breathing maze, designed to confuse and contain. Her only map was her own sharpening fear, and the desperate, fluttering hope that the scroll in her hand was worth this descent into a place that felt less like a library and more like a predator, patiently waiting to see if its new prey could outthink its endless, shifting corridors. The weeping was a soft, broken sound, a human crack in the ancient silence. Elara followed it, not out of curiosity, but because it was the only sign of life in this stone labyrinth. She found him huddled in a small alcove, surrounded by the scattered tools of his former trade, a delicate brush and a pot of dried ink. He was Kael, a man whose face was a roadmap of despair, his eyes holding the hollow look of someone who had been forgotten by the world. He was a Scrollmaker, he explained in a voice rough with disuse, exiled here years ago for the crime of questioning the Conclave's official histories. His heresy was believing the Valar were not always perfect. His punishment was to be erased, forced to mend the very texts that proclaimed the lies that had destroyed him. Elara's hand tightened on the scroll she had stolen. Here was the very proof that her quest was not madness. To trust him was an immense risk, a leap into the unknown based on little more than shared desperation. Yet, keeping the scroll to herself felt like a greater danger. She slowly unrolled it, the silver script, casting its eerie light on his tear-streaked face. His breath caught. He recognized the script style instantly, a precursor to all modern writing, a language lost to time. He was not just a broken man, he was a master of his craft, and he understood what she held in a way she never could. This was not merely a text, he whispered. It was a key. Their alliance was forged in that dim glow, a fragile pact between the hunter and the long-captured prey. Kael knew the archive's tricks, its shifting moods and hidden pathways. He could guide her out, but this guidance came with a heavy price. By aligning with him, Elara was no longer just a thief, stealing a secret. She was now a conspirator, actively sheltering the Conclave's most hated heretic. Her rebellion was no longer a solitary one. Every step she took now also carried the weight of Kael's survival, his hope for redemption, resting entirely on her success. If she failed, she would not simply be erased. She would be the reason another soul was completely extinguished. The maze of stone was now a maze of loyalties, and every choice echoed with the consequences for 2 lives instead of 1. The walls of the chamber seemed to breathe, each stone pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light. Sealed within glowing, crystalline casings were the scrolls themselves, and from them came a chorus of whispers. Fragments of forgotten names, echoes of long-lost debates, the ghost of a melody from before the world was shaped. It all swirled around Elara in a dizzying cacophony of lore. Kael stood beside her, his own face pale in the ethereal glow. He explained that this was the Whispering Vault, a place where the most volatile truths were kept, truths that could not be merely read, but had to be answered. To unseal one, a seeker must offer a part of themselves, a single drop of blood to prove their commitment to the knowledge, and to bind the consequence of that knowledge to their own spirit. The risk was a spiritual poison, a slow erosion of the self for a truth too terrible to bear. Elara's hand trembled as she brought the tip of her dagger to her thumb. The decision was paralyzing. Which whisper held the key, which contained the truth about the Valar's flawed nature? She closed her eyes, letting the whispers wash over her, until one voice, clear and sorrowful above the rest, seemed to call her name. She pressed her bleeding thumb to that scroll's casing. The crystal did not shatter, but dissolved like mist, and the scroll unfurled on its own. The script that blazed to life was not the silver of history, but a deep, ominous gold. She had not found a record of the past. She was reading a prophecy. It spoke of a coming convergence, a moment when the hidden flaws of the Valar would ripple outwards, unraveling the very fabric of their creation. The goal was no longer to expose a buried secret. It was to stop a future that was already in motion. Their quest had just transformed from an act of rebellion into a desperate race against time. The words of the prophecy burned in the air long after Elara had spoken them aloud, a golden script of fate that now felt irrevocably tied to her own breath. It spoke of a celestial alignment, a single moment when the stars themselves would converge in a pattern not seen since the dawn of time. In that moment, the connection between the Valar and the world would be tested. The hidden truths of their past, scattered and locked away in other lost texts, would act as the fulcrum. If these truths remained buried, the alignment would sever the Valar from their creation forever, leaving the world adrift and untethered. But if the truths were brought to light, the connection could be renewed, forged anew on a foundation of honesty rather than myth. The fate of everything now hinged on a scavenger hunt through a living maze for pages of a story no one was supposed to remember. Kael stared at her, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. By speaking the prophecy, she had not merely read it, she had activated it. Her voice was the trigger, and her spirit was now the vessel for its unfolding. A faint, golden light seemed to cling to her skin, a visible marker of her new role that made her feel both powerful and profoundly exposed. It was this very light that betrayed them. From the deep shadows of a collapsed archway, a figure detached itself from the darkness. It was not a warden of the Conclave. This seeker moved with a liquid grace that was altogether more sinister, its form shrouded in tattered robes that drank the light from the air. It had been waiting, it seemed, for the prophecy to find its voice, and now it knew whose voice that was. The figure did not speak, but its intent was a cold pressure in the room. It too sought the lost texts, not to renew the world, but to ensure the severance, to claim the power of a broken cosmos for itself. Elara's quest was no longer a race against time, but a duel with a rival who now saw her not as an obstacle, but as the key. The golden light, clinging to Elara's skin, seemed to pulse in time with her racing heart, a beacon in the gloom. Kael's eyes were fixed not on her, but on the shadows where their new enemy had vanished. "We cannot stay here," he finally whispered, his voice tight with a fear she had not heard in him before. His hands trembled as he rolled up his sleeve, revealing a mark she had never seen. It was not a scar, but a brand etched into his forearm. The symbol was a stylized eye, weeping a single black tear. This was the mark of the Unbound, he explained, a secret sect of Scrollmakers who, generations ago, first uncovered the lies about the Valar and tried to reveal them. The Conclave hunted them to the edge of extinction. I was one of the last initiates. I hid my past, even from you, because this mark is more than a memory. It is a conduit. The Conclave can use it to find me, to listen, if they focus their power. By showing it to you now, I have likely alerted them to our presence. Their fragile sanctuary was shattered in an instant. The maze was no longer just a physical threat, but a hunting ground where their every moment of respite was now a countdown. Elara understood the profound weight of his confession. He had not just trusted her with his story, he had sacrificed their last safe haven to ensure she understood the full scope of the enemy they faced. This was not one single rival in the dark, but the entire might of the Conclave, now aware that their most hated heretic and the living vessel of a world-ending prophecy were together deep within their most guarded place. They had to move, and they had to move now, with the brand on Kael's arm serving as a ticking clock, drawing their pursuers ever closer to the truth they carried. The brand on Kael's arm was no longer just a mark. It was a scream in the silence. "We have to go deeper," he urged, his voice raw, down where even the wardens fear to tread. Their only path led to a crumbling staircase, its stones slick with a damp cold that seeped into their bones. At the bottom, a vast, dark expanse of water stretched before them, the surface oily and still. This was the Sunken Library, a flooded level of the archive where forgotten scriptoriums lay submerged. Without a word, they plunged in. The water was ice cold, a shock that stole their breath. As they swam, their movements stirred the depths, and clouds of ancient, dissolved ink bloomed around them like ghostly wounds, obscuring their vision in swirls of black and deep blue. They were swimming through the ghosts of lost words. Elara clutched the precious scrolls to her chest, but the water was already doing its work. She felt the delicate parchment soften, the silvery script on one begin to blur and run, its light fading into the murk. A potential clue, a piece of the prophecy's puzzle, was dissolving before her eyes, lost forever to the corrosive touch of the past. In that moment, a terrible clarity seized her. She could not save them all. She had to choose. With a heart-wrenching lurch, she let one damaged scroll sink into the abyss, its secrets returning to the silence, so she could tighten her grip on the others. It was not a calculated move. It was an instinct, a visceral need to preserve the story, the truth, at any cost. Her own safety, even their escape, felt secondary to the weight of the knowledge in her hands. Kael watched her, his own face a mask of understanding. She was no longer just a scholar on a mission. The quest had changed her. She was now a guardian, willing to let part of the map vanish if it meant the rest of the journey could continue. The waterlogged scrolls felt impossibly heavy in Elara's arms as they dragged themselves onto a slick, stone platform rising from the murk. Before them stood a silent sentinel, a figure carved from the same dark stone as the archive itself, its surface smoothed by centuries of dripping water. It was a guardian, motionless and imposing, one hand outstretched and holding the broken pieces of a clay tablet. The air around it hummed with a dormant power. Kael drew a sharp breath. "It will not let us pass," he whispered, "unless we prove we are more than thieves. It demands we restore what was broken." The scattered fragments were covered in a script so ancient it looked like the cracks in old stone. As Elara and Kael began to piece them together, their wet fingers fumbling with the shards, the true test became clear. This was not a puzzle of shape, but of meaning. The fragments formed a plea, a single, desperate question, asked in a dead language. What is the price of a forgotten song? Elara's mind raced. The answer was not in the library's official histories. It was in the prophecy still burning in her memory, in the golden words that spoke of sacrifice and renewal. She looked from the reassembled question to the stone giant's blank face, and she knew. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the cavernous space. She did not answer the question. She sang a single, mournful line from the prophecy itself, a lament for a lost age. The effect was immediate. The guardian's stone hand slowly retracted. Its head bowed in a gesture of ancient respect, and the wall behind it slid away, revealing a dry passage forward. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over Elara, as if the song had drawn its power directly from her spirit, but the cost was higher than her fatigue. The moment the prophetic words left her lips, a pulse of golden energy, visible and sharp, radiated out from her, rippling across the dark water. In the distant shadows, a pair of eyes snapped open, sensing the resonant echo. Their solution had been a key, but it had also been a flare, signaling their exact location to the one who hunted them in the silence. The echo of her own prophetic song had not yet faded when the shadows behind the stone guardian coalesced into a human form. Morwen moved with a silence that was more unnerving than any warden's heavy tread, her tattered robes seeming to absorb the faint light from Elara's skin. In her hand was not a weapon, but a scribe's knife, its edge honed to a cruel sharpness. "She was one of us," Kael breathed, his voice thick with a horrified recognition. A Scrollmaker who fell to the lure of the Unbound's original sin, not seeking truth, but the power that comes from being the only one who knows it. Elara had no time to process this. Morwen's gaze was locked on the primary scroll, the one with the silvery script that had started it all, still clutched in Elara's hand. The ambush was not a clash of steel, but a blur of stolen motion. Morwen flowed past Kael's defensive stance, her knife slicing not at flesh, but at the leather strap, securing the scroll case to Elara's belt. The case came free. Elara reacted on pure, desperate instinct. She lunged, her body a clumsy weapon, against the other woman's fluid grace. Her shoulder connected hard with Morwen's side, and for one triumphant second, she thought she had won. But Morwen simply twisted with the impact, using Elara's own momentum to send her sprawling onto the cold stone. The scroll case skittered from Morwen's grip, and Elara's fingers brushed its edge before it was snatched up again. A sharp, hot pain lanced through her ankle as it twisted beneath her. The sound of Morwen's retreating footsteps was swallowed by the darkness almost instantly, leaving behind only the scent of old ink and dust. Elara lay on the ground, the physical ache in her leg nothing compared to the hollow emptiness in her chest. She had failed. The very heart of her proof, the reason for this entire terrifying journey, was gone. Her breath came in ragged gasps, not from the pain, but from the crushing realization of what had just happened. This was not a theoretical debate in a quiet scholar's hall anymore. She was not an observer of a conflict. She was a participant, and she had just lost the first, most crucial battle. The proof of the Valar's flawed history was now in the hands of someone who wanted to use it not to save the world, but to break it, and her own confidence lay shattered on the stone floor beside her. What do you do when the truth you have sacrificed everything for is taken and used as a weapon against all you hope to save? The cold stone beneath her cheek felt like the final judgment of the entire archive. Elara pushed herself up, her ankle screaming in protest, but the physical pain was a distant echo of the hollow void inside her. The scroll was gone. Kael's hand found her shoulder, his grip firm. "There is a place," he murmured, his voice low and urgent. A market of sorts, it moves, hidden in the archive's forgotten arteries. They trade in whispers and lost things. To find our thief, we must go where the light never reaches. The path he led her down was not one of stone and shelf, but of memory and decay. They navigated corridors lined with the skeletal remains of forgotten card catalogs, their drawers hanging open like empty rib cages. The air grew thick with the scent of mildew and desperate hope. Then a sound reached them, a low, susurating murmur that was the antithesis of the archive's enforced silence. It was the sound of commerce. The market was not a place of stalls and goods, but of shifting circles of lamplight in a vast, dark cavern. Figures huddled in these pools of illumination, their faces obscured by deep hoods. They did not trade in coins. They traded in secrets, in snippets of prophecy, in the locations of lost texts. One such figure, an informant who called herself the Echo, knew of Morwen. Her price was not gold, but a memory made solid. She wanted the locket Elara wore, a simple silver oval containing the only existing portrait of her mother, a woman who had died believing in the Conclave's perfect valor. It was the last tangible piece of Elara's life before this quest, a life of quiet scholarship and accepted truths. To hand it over was to sever her final link to the person she used to be. Her fingers trembled as she unclasped the chain. The metal was warm from her skin. She placed the locket in the Echo's waiting, gloved hand. In that moment, she felt a snap, a clean and terrible break with everything she had once held dear. The information they received was a cold shock. Morwen was not seeking to reveal the Valar's flawed history to the world. She was gathering the texts to perform a ritual of her own design, a perversion of the prophecy. She intended to use the lost truths, not as a key to renewal, but as a weapon to shatter the Valar's connection herself. In the resulting chaos, she believed she could seize the raw, unformed power of a broken cosmos and rewrite reality according to her own will. Elara's quest was no longer about exposing a hidden past. It was a battle for the future's very ink. She had traded her past for this terrible knowledge, and now she had to stop a scribe who wanted to become a god. The air itself tasted of forgotten music. Following the Echo's directions, they arrived at the base of a structure that defied the archive's stone logic, a citadel of pale, spiraling rock that floated, unmoored, above a bottomless chasm. It was held aloft by no visible support, and from its countless open archways drifted a low, constant hum, a chorus of 1,000 fractured melodies. These were the lost songs of the Valar, their power so potent that even their broken echoes could warp reality. The only way across was a bridge of solidified sound, a ribbon of shimmering, translucent energy that connected the cliff edge to the Citadel's gate. But as they stepped onto it, the bridge groaned, its form flickering. Cracks of pure silence splintered through its surface, threatening to dissolve into nothingness and send them falling into the void. The songs swirling around them were discordant, their harmonies clashing and tearing at the bridge's fabric. Without thinking, Elara opened her mouth. Her voice, still raw from her earlier prophetic song, was a fragile thread against the cacophony. She did not shout. She sang a single, clear note, then a phrase of an older melody, one she had never learned, but that rose from some deep, instinctual place within her. It was a counter melody, a thread of harmony that wove between the clashing fragments, finding the lost rhythm that once bound them together. The bridge shuddered, then steadied, the cracks sealing as her voice lent it a temporary, desperate cohesion. They scrambled across just as the final note left her lips. On the other side, her knees buckled. Her throat felt scorched, as if she had swallowed fire. But more terrifying than the physical cost was the realization that settled deep in her bones. This power was not in the scrolls, it was in her. A resonance with the Valar's own primal magic was awakening, a connection she had sought to study from a distance, not to embody. With every use, she felt less like a scholar, uncovering a secret, and more like an instrument being tuned for a purpose she did not yet understand. To stop Morwen, she would have to embrace this terrifying affinity, and in doing so, risk becoming a part of the very power she was trying to save the world from. The chamber at the Citadel's heart was a vortex of stolen power. Morwen stood at its center, the stolen scroll hovering before her, its silvery script now twisted and bleeding a corrosive violet light. She was not reading the text. She was branding it, using a shard of dark crystal to sear her own will into the parchment, rewriting the Valar's flawed history into a story where she was the author of a new creation. The air crackled with the strain, the very stones of the Citadel groaning in protest. Elara saw the truth in an instant. To interrupt was to risk a cataclysmic magical backlash, an explosion of raw, unformed reality. But to do nothing was to let Morwen win. Her eyes darted to the source of the corruption, the dark crystal in Morwen's hand, pulsing like a diseased heart. There was no time for a plan, only for a single, desperate act. She hurled a loose piece of rubble, not at Morwen, but at the crystal itself. The stone struck true. A sound like a universe shattering filled the chamber. The violet light did not fade, it detonated. A wave of concussive force, thick with the screams of 1,000 rewritten words, threw Elara backward. When her vision cleared, the scroll lay dormant on the floor, its script silver once more. But Morwen was gone, vanished into the chaotic energies, and Kael lay motionless a few feet away, a shard of the exploded crystal embedded in his shoulder, the flesh around it already blackening and withering. The choice was immediate and brutal, a blade in her soul. She could chase the fading echo of Morwen's escape, or she could stay and try to save the man who had trusted her. There was no debate. She fell to her knees beside Kael, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch it. His loyalty had cost him this. Her quest had demanded this price. In that moment, the abstract cause of truth became painfully, terribly personal. It had a name, and it was Kael, and his life was now more important than any scroll, any prophecy, any future. The fate of the world would have to wait. The blackened flesh around the crystal shard felt cold and brittle, like ancient parchment. Elara's hands trembled as she unrolled the minor healing scroll she had saved from the water, its script a gentle, calming green. She followed the instructions with a desperate precision, grinding a dried leaf from her pouch into a paste with a few drops of water, her movements a frantic prayer against the spreading decay. As she applied the poultice, the green light flared, knitting the worst of the damage and halting the black tendrils creeping towards Kael's heart. His breathing eased from a ragged gasp to a shallow, steady rhythm. He was stable, but far from safe. Every second spent on her knees was a second Morwen used to vanish deeper into the Citadel with another stolen text, a ledger of the Valar's earliest regrets. The choice had been made in a heartbeat, a visceral pull to save the life before her over the abstract salvation of the world. This was no longer a scholarly debate. It was a blood pact. Her morality was no longer a set of principles, but the weight of a man's breath in the silent air. Yet that profound human choice had a brutal cost. The urgency of their quest now burned with a new, terrifying intensity. Morwen was not just ahead, she was consolidating her power, and every moment of their delay made her final ritual more inevitable. Saving one life might have just made saving all of them infinitely harder. The ghost light of the Geists cast no warmth, only a pale, shimmering cold that made the air feel thin and ancient. They stood in a vast, circular chamber, the Council of Geists, formless beings of woven memory and regret, who watched her with the weight of millennia. These were the spirits of the first Scrollmakers, the architects of the archive itself, and they were the only power left that might know a path Morwen would not expect. To ask for their aid, Elara had to prove her cause was not just ambition, but necessity. She had one piece of evidence that could bridge the chasm of their distrust. With a trembling hand, she unrolled the prophecy scroll, the golden script blazing to life in the spectral gloom. She did not read it. She simply held it up, letting its terrible, beautiful truth radiate outwards. The Geists recoiled as one, a silent, shimmering wave of shock. Then, one by one, they drifted closer, their formless edges brushing against the parchment. They were not reading the words, they were feeling them, tasting the authenticity of the fate etched into the fiber. It was a language they understood far better than she ever could. A single, resonant thought echoed in the chamber, a verdict felt rather than heard. Your sincerity is accepted. But as the thought solidified, the golden light of the scroll began to fade, leaching from the parchment and flowing into the assembled Geists. The script dimmed from brilliant gold to a dull, lifeless brown, the magic that had given it power now absorbed by the ancestral spirits as the price of their belief. The scroll was now just an old piece of paper, its words still visible, but its potent connection to the prophecy severed forever. Elara stared at the inert parchment, a profound loss settling in her chest. She had traded a key for a clue. The Geists, now humming with a new, unified purpose, showed them a vision, a fleeting image of a needle of black stone piercing a storm-racked sky. The Adamantine Spire. Morwen's destination was now known, but the map that could have guided them was gone. They were left with only the memory of the prophecy's words and the chilling certainty that their final journey would be made blind, trusting their wits against a foe who now held every tangible advantage. The Adamantine Spire was not a mountain of rock, but of pure, polished memory, and the winds that screamed around its peak were scouring away at everything they were. Each gust felt like a physical blow, not to their bodies, but to their minds, threatening to tear loose the very thoughts that held them together. Their ascent was a brutal, vertical crawl, driven by pitons hammered into fissures and ropes, stretched taut with their shared weight. Elara's hands, once soft from handling parchment, were now raw and bleeding, her muscles screaming with a fire she had never known. She was learning a new language, one of strain and friction, and the absolute trust placed in a thin strand of woven fiber. That trust was tested in a single, heart-stopping second. A sharp crack echoed, barely audible over the wind's roar. The rope supporting Kael, already weakened by their grueling climb, frayed and snapped. He fell, his body a sudden, terrifying weight against her own harness. The jolt was immense, a violent wrench that slammed her against the sheer face, the remaining rope biting deep into her waist. For a moment, pure, undiluted terror seized her. Her grip felt weak, her strength non-existent. To let go would be to save herself, to live to fight another day. But the thought was a ghost, instantly banished by the sight of Kael dangling below, his life literally hanging from the line in her hands. She did not think. She braced her feet, wrapped the rope around her forearm in a brutal lock, and held. Her world narrowed to the burning fibers, the scream of the wind, and the absolute refusal to let go. Her muscles trembled violently, but they held. In that endless moment, suspended between the abyss and the sky, their partnership was forged into something unbreakable. She was no longer just protecting a source of information or a fellow conspirator. She was holding on to a friend. When Kael finally found a new foothold and secured himself, his gaze met hers, and no words were needed. The climb was no longer just a journey to a destination. It was the physical proof that her courage was no longer an idea, but a tangible force, carved into her bleeding hands and her unyielding will. The door to the spire's peak did not open, but dissolved, revealing a chamber of impossible stillness. At its center stood a pool of what looked like liquid silver, its surface holding a perfect, motionless reflection of the vaulted ceiling. This was the Mirror of Truth. Elara approached it, her breath catching, for the reflection it showed was not of the room around them, but of something else entirely. It was a memory, not as a story told, but as a moment lived. She saw the Valar not as the distant, flawless gods of the Conclave's teachings, but as beings of immense light and deep shadow. She watched as they debated, their voices a symphony of anguish and hope. She witnessed a moment of catastrophic choice, a decision made not from malice, but from a desperate, tragic love for their creation, a choice that introduced fallibility into the world to save it from a far worse fate of static perfection. The perfect, distant deities she had been taught to revere vanished. In their place were architects heartbroken by the necessary flaws woven into their own masterpiece. The foundation of her entire life, her scholarship, her very understanding of divinity, crumbled into dust in the space of a single, silent vision. It was the most terrifying and liberating moment of her existence. Her quest was no longer about proving the Conclave wrong or exposing a lie for the sake of truth. Staring into the raw, unvarnished pain of these creators, she felt a surge of empathy, so profound it felt like a physical wound. They had not been perfect. They had been brave and afraid, and they had made a choice that haunted them for eons. Her mission transformed in that instant. It was no longer an academic exercise or a rebellion against authority. It was an act of personal redemption, a need to help finish the story they had begun, to heal a wound that had been festering since the dawn of time. How do you forgive a god for being flawed? And how do you find the courage to help them mend a broken world? Morwen stood between them and the mirror, her face a mask of bitter triumph. You never told her, did you, Kael? Her voice was a lash, cutting through the silence. You never told your new protege that I was your old one. Elara felt the air leave her lungs. Kael's face went ashen. Morwen had been his apprentice, his brightest student, the one he had trusted with his earliest, most dangerous doubts about the Conclave. But when she had pushed to make their findings public, to risk everything for the truth, Kael had refused. He had counseled patience, silence, fearful of the Conclave's wrath. He chose the safety of their dogma over the risk of our truth. Morwen spat, her gaze locked on Kael. He did not just disappoint me, he betrayed the very cause he claimed to serve. And in that moment of shared, agonizing revelation, Morwen made her final move. Her hand slammed against the mirror's frame. The liquid silver of its surface did not shatter, but it did not ripple. It hardened, and the light in the chamber twisted, bending in on itself. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of old ink and regret. The wards were not designed to kill, but to punish, to imprison the mind in the very moment of its greatest failure. The world dissolved around them, the solid stone of the spire, melting into the ghostly shapes of a memory. They were no longer on the peak. They were in Kael's old scriptorium, years in the past. A younger, terrified Kael was pleading with a passionate, furious Morwen, begging her to burn their notes, to forget what they had found. Elara and the present-day Kael were trapped as silent, helpless spectators, forced to watch the pivotal moment that created the monster they now faced. The emotional stakes were no longer about saving the world. They were about surviving the truth of their own alliance. Elara was forced to witness the exact moment Kael's courage had failed, to see the fear in his eyes that had cost him his first apprentice and set Morwen on her dark path. The trust they had forged on the cliffside, the partnership born of shared sacrifice, was now being tested in the most brutal way possible. Could she still trust a man who had once chosen fear over truth? Could Kael bear to see his greatest shame played out before the one person whose faith he now needed most? The loop began again, the same argument starting over, trapping them in an endless cycle of a past mistake, a consequence far more cruel than any physical prison. The memory loop was a perfect, agonizing circle. Kael's pleas and Morwen's fury echoed in the same relentless rhythm, a spiritual torture designed to break them with the weight of a single, shared failure. Elara watched Kael's face contort with fresh pain. Each time, the cycle began anew, and she knew that to remain here was to let the past win. The solution did not lie in fighting the memory, but in disrupting the magic that held it. She remembered the bridge of solidified sound in the Citadel, and how her own voice had woven harmony from chaos. The mirror was a similar instrument, its power bound to a single, resonant frequency. Closing her eyes against the heartbreaking scene, she shut out the sound of Kael's younger self begging for silence. She listened instead for the silence beneath the sound, for the foundational note that held the ward together. It was there, a faint, high hum at the edge of her hearing. She focused every ounce of her will, drawing a breath that felt like it might tear her lungs, and sang a single, pure harmonic. The note was not loud, but it was perfect. It sliced through the memory like a blade through old canvas. The spectral scriptorium flickered, the ghostly figures of Kael and Morwen dissolving into static. With a deafening crack that was felt more than heard, the mirror of truth shattered. A wave of silent force threw Elara backward as the liquid silver surface exploded into a million glittering shards, each one reflecting a different, fleeting image of the past, before winking out into nothingness. The artifact was gone, the ultimate source of truth, the very object that had shown her the Valar's true nature, was now destroyed by her own hand. In that moment, the choice was terrifyingly clear. She had sacrificed the ability to ever look into that perfect past again, trading the comfort of certain knowledge for the uncertain, messy potential of the future. She chose Kael's life and their shared mission over the preservation of a relic. The past could no longer be a prison. It could only be a lesson, one they would have to carry forward without a map, trusting that the truth they had already absorbed was enough to light their way through the darkness yet to come. The glittering shards of the mirror were still falling through the air when Elara moved. Her eyes, sharpened by adrenaline, caught the bundle of scrolls that had tumbled from Morwen's grasp in the magical backlash. She dove, her body a single line of intent, her fingers closing around the familiar, rough leather of the scroll cases. It was a swift, desperate grab, a reclamation of their entire purpose. For a single, soaring moment, she felt a surge of victory. They had them back. The stolen histories, the ledgers of regret, the proof they had bled for was in her hands. But the triumph was hollow and short-lived. As Elara clutched the recovered texts to her chest, her gaze locked with Morwen's across the chamber. Her rival was not looking at the scrolls she had just lost. A cold, knowing smile touched Morwen's lips as her hand went to a hidden fold in her tattered robes, pressing protectively against something concealed within. She had not lost everything. She had kept the most important one. The final, most powerful text was still with her, a last piece of the puzzle that was hers alone. The realization was a cold stone in Elara's gut. This was not a setback for Morwen. It was merely the end of the prologue. The true ritual, the one that would use the combined power of all the lost texts during the celestial alignment, was still within her reach. Morwen did not need every scroll to succeed. She only needed the key ones, and she had ensured she held the master key. The stakes were no longer about possessing evidence. They were now about preventing a singular, catastrophic event. The alignment was not a distant, abstract deadline anymore. It was a ticking clock, counting down to the moment Morwen would attempt to unravel creation itself, using the Valar's own hidden history as the weapon to do it. They had the body of the story back, but the villain still held the explosive final chapter. The sky itself was the clock, and its hands were the slow, inexorable dance of unfamiliar stars. With the alignment mere hours away, every ragged breath Elara and Kael took felt like a grain of sand falling through a cosmic hourglass. Their destination was the Starfall Amphitheater, a place so ancient it was said to have been carved by the first light of creation, its open bowl designed to drink directly from the heavens. Reaching it meant crossing the Serpent's Rib, a narrow, crumbling ridge of rock that coiled around the mountain's peak like a fossilized spine. One misstep meant a fall into endless cloud. They moved with a new, hardened efficiency, their previous frantic energy replaced by a grim economy of motion. When a patrol of Conclave wardens blocked the main path, their humming staffs casting a searching blue light, Elara did not freeze. She pointed to a precariously balanced rock pillar further up the slope. Kael understood instantly. He used his remaining strength to pry loose a smaller stone, sending it clattering down to strike the pillar's base. The resulting avalanche was small, but the cascade of noise and dust was enough to pull the wardens away, creating a narrow window for their escape. This was no longer blind flight. It was tactical. a deliberate manipulation of their surroundings that spoke of a profound shift in their spirits. They were no longer just reacting to threats, they were creating opportunities. The exhaustion was a physical weight, making their limbs feel like lead and their thoughts slow and thick. Yet, this very weariness stripped away all hesitation, forcing a clarity they had lacked before. Every decision was immediate and final. When they finally crested the final rise and saw the amphitheater below, a vast stone bowl open to the deepening twilight, the sight was less a relief and more a confirmation of the immense scale of the conflict to come. They had survived the journey, but the true test was now waiting for them under the gathering stars. A final confrontation where the past would demand its reckoning from the future. The Starfall Amphitheater was a crucible of silence, a vast stone bowl holding its breath for the coming alignment. Before Morwen could begin her ritual, the air was torn by the dissonant hum of a dozen sensing staffs. Conclave wardens poured into the arena from the upper terraces, their polished armor reflecting the starlight, a wall of sanctioned authority descending to enforce its version of peace. Their leader's voice boomed across the stone, a command to surrender all blasphemous texts and submit to the cleansing silence of the conclave. In that moment, the entire conflict pivoted. Morwen was a heretic, but the wardens were a force of absolute erasure. They would not just stop the ritual, they would destroy every scroll, purge every memory, and bury the truth so deep it could never be found again. Elara's decision was not a calculation, but a gut-deep instinct that bypassed all reason. She met Morwen's furious gaze across the stone floor and gave a single, sharp nod. The enemy of my enemy is not my friend, but he is a temporary shield. This fragile, hateful alliance was forged in the space of a single breath. A moral choice, so shocking, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She was now standing with the woman who had tried to kill Kael, all to protect the truth from a power that wanted to unwrite it entirely. The battlefield was no longer a simple duel. It was a three-sided war, a chaotic triangle of conflicting desires where the only rule for survival was to hold your enemy close enough to feel their heartbeat and to know the exact moment you would have to let go. Could a shared threat truly unite two people who wanted to use the same truth for opposite ends of creation? Their three-sided war collapsed into a desperate two-front defense. Elara, Kael, and Morwen fell into a wordless, triangular formation, their backs to each other as the first wave of wardens closed in. The air crackled with the hum of their staffs, a sound that promised not death, but erasure. Morwen snarled a command, her voice cutting through the chaos. The central altar, it has defensive protocols. Kael, the western pillar, Elara, the eastern. They moved as one fractured mind, each sprinting to a different carved stone monolith that ringed the amphitheater's floor. Kael's fingers, though torn and bleeding, found the precise sequence of pressure points on the western stone, a code known only to the most senior scrollmakers. Elara mirrored his actions on the eastern pillar, her touch activating ancient, buried mechanisms. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan that seemed to come from the mountain's core, arcs of pure white energy erupted from the ground, weaving a shimmering, domed barrier between the monoliths. The first warden to touch it was thrown backward, his staff flickering and dying. They had bought themselves a shield, but the cost was immediate and terrifying. The light of the stars above seemed to dim, as if the amphitheater itself had sighed in exhaustion. The energy required to power the barrier was the site's own latent magic, the very power that was supposed to stabilize the coming ritual. They had just used their only buffer, trading a safe container for a temporary reprieve from the Conclave. Now, when the alignment peaked and Morwen attempted her ritual, there would be no protective framework to contain the volatile forces. The outcome would be raw, unfiltered, and utterly unpredictable. The temporary truce had saved them from capture, but it had also guaranteed that whatever happened next would shake the foundations of the world, for better or for infinitely worse. The first star ignited, a point of searing white light that tore a silent scream across the heavens. Morwen threw her arms wide, and the hidden scroll in her grasp erupted. A beam of corrupted violet energy, thick with the rewritten words of the Valar's history, shot from the parchment into the sky. It was not a request. It was a command, a concentrated will aimed at the heart of the alignment, seeking to overwrite reality with her own bitter narrative. Elara felt the wrongness of it like a physical sickness, a discordant note that threatened to shatter the world's very melody. Attacking Morwen directly was impossible, a physical struggle that would only feed the chaos. Instead, Elara closed her eyes, shutting out the violent light. She reached for the memory of the Mirror of Truth, for the raw, unvarnished pain and love she had seen in the Valar's faces. She did not shout, she sang. Her voice, raw and thin at first, rose in a counter-melody, the true, unaltered song of creation, as she had learned it from the prophecy and felt it in her own soul. It was a lament for a lost age, a hymn of flawed but genuine love, a harmony that accepted the cracks in the world as part of its beauty. The two forces collided not with a crash, but with a terrible, warring resonance. Morwen's beam of will was a spear of pure control, demanding the universe bend. Elara's song was an open hand, an invitation for it to remember itself. The air in the amphitheater began to warp, the very stone under their feet, groaning as two opposing versions of truth fought for dominance. It was a duel not of magic, but of meaning. Could a lie, no matter how powerfully enforced, truly silence a truth sung with enough conviction? The stars themselves seemed to be listening, their light flickering between the violent violet and the soft, steadfast gold of Elara's song. Her voice was a raw, bleeding thing in her chest, each note torn from a place of profound exhaustion and even deeper conviction. The two harmonies warred in the air above them, a visible storm of clashing intent. Morwen's violet beam was a rigid, angular script of pure command, demanding the universe bend to her will. Elara's golden song was a flowing, organic melody, an invitation to remember a more beautiful, if flawed, design. The amphitheater itself could not contain the strain. The ancient stone under their feet began to fracture, deep cracks snaking through the floor as the very architecture of the place groaned in protest, caught between two opposing definitions of reality. The physical effort was a mirror of her entire journey, a brutal expenditure of every last reserve of strength she possessed. And in that moment of utter depletion, the last vestiges of her internal conflict finally shattered. The doubt that had haunted her, the fear that she was just an arrogant scholar, meddling in forces beyond her, simply burned away in the crucible of her song. She was not trying to control the power. She was not trying to become a new god or rewrite the story. She was simply giving the truth a voice, acting as a conduit for a story that desperately needed to be heard. It was a surrender, not to Morwen, but to her own purpose. She accepted that her worth was not in her flawless execution, but in her willingness to be the vessel, to stand and sing until her voice gave out, offering the authentic, broken, and beautiful history of the Valar back to the stars themselves. The choice was no longer about winning. It was about bearing witness, and in that acceptance, she found a strength that no amount of personal ambition could ever provide. The balance was breaking. Elara's voice faltered, a single cracked note in the symphony of warring lights, and the violet corruption surged forward, threatening to drown her golden song. Kael saw it in the strain on her face, in the way her body trembled on the verge of collapse. There was no time for words, no time for a final farewell. He met her eyes for one last, profound moment, an entire conversation of gratitude and apology passing between them in a heartbeat. Then he moved. He did not run. He walked calmly into the raging nexus of the ritual circle, the space between Elara's song and Morwen's beam. He placed his hands on Elara's shoulders, not to steady her, but to give her everything he had left. He became a conduit, a living anchor. His own life force, the very essence of his spirit, flowed into her, a sudden, immense surge of power that was not magical, but deeply, fundamentally human. It was the strength of his regrets, his loyalty, his final, absolute act of faith. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The redirected energy, now grounded in a willing sacrifice, shattered the delicate equilibrium Morwen was struggling to maintain. Her concentration broke with a gasp, the violet beam flickering wildly as she was thrown backward by the backlash. But the cost was absolute. Kael's grip on Elara's shoulders loosened. His body went limp, and he crumpled to the fractured stone, his life extinguished not by violence, but by a final, total gift. The world seemed to stop for Elara. The roar of the clashing magics faded into a dull, distant hum. All she could see was Kael's still form, the quiet peace on his face, a stark contrast to the cataclysm swirling around them. Her breath caught, a sob trapped in her ruined throat. This was the price. This was the terrible, personal cost of the truth she had fought for. Yet in that shattering moment of grief, a terrifying clarity was born. His sacrifice had not just broken Morwen's focus, it had purified the energy in the circle. The power was now hers alone to command, a river of raw potential that had been cleansed by his final act. Her sorrow did not weaken her song, it became its foundation. Her voice rose again, not in a plea, but in a declaration. It was a song of mourning and of memory, a tribute to the flawed, brave beings who had made the world and the flawed, brave man who had just died to save it. The golden light swelled, no longer just harmonizing, but healing, washing over the fractured amphitheater and the corrupted sky, seeking to mend the very tears and reality that the conflict had created. She had lost her guide, her friend, but in his passing, she had found the final, heartbreaking strength to finish what they had started together. Her song became a torrent of pure, unvarnished truth. Fueled by Kael's final gift, the golden light from her voice washed over the amphitheater, and the scrolls in her arms and the one fallen from Morwen's grasp shuddered to life. They did not burn. They rose, unrolling themselves into the air, and their ancient scripts dissolved from ink and parchment into constellations of brilliant, shimmering light. The words themselves became stars, painting the night sky with the complete and unedited story of the Valar. Every soul present, from the fallen wardens to the defiant Morwen, saw it all unfold in a silent, breathtaking panorama. They witnessed the moments of divine inspiration, the glorious triumphs of creation, but also the bitter arguments, the tragic miscalculations born of love, and the profound, hidden regret for the flaw of mortality they had woven into the world to save it. History was not being rewritten, it was being remembered. The simple, perfect myth of the Conclave shattered and vanished like mist, replaced by a story infinitely more complex, more human, and ultimately, more sacred in its honest brokenness. This was not an attack on the foundations of the world. It was a healing. The violent, ragged rift, torn by Morwen's ritual, began to knit itself back together, the edges of reality softening and merging as if soothed by a balm of long-lost memory. Above it all, the celestial alignment reached its zenith, but instead of a cataclysm, it culminated in a gentle, stabilizing shower of starlight, a rain of silent affirmation that washed over the land. The connection between the Valar and their creation was not severed. It was renewed, forged anew not on a lie of perfection, but on the solid, enduring ground of shared history and accepted fallibility. The world was not broken. It was finally, fully seen, and in that moment of collective witness, a new, more profound silence fell, one not of enforced dogma, but of awe-struck understanding. What does it mean for a world to finally meet its makers and find them worthy not because they were perfect, but because they tried? Morwen did not move as the constellations of truth blazed overhead. Her face, once a mask of bitter resolve, crumbled. The raw, unedited history of the Valar played out in the sky, and she saw not a weapon to be wielded, but a story of beings as flawed and conflicted as she was. The grand narrative of control, she had built her life upon, shattered into dust, leaving only the hollow echo of her own rage. A broken sob escaped her, the sound lost in the gentle rain of starlight. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining from her completely. The final scroll, the one she had kept hidden against her heart, felt suddenly heavy, not with power, but with the weight of her own misguided ambition. With trembling hands, she pulled it from her robes. She did not throw it or place it with ceremony. She simply let it fall from her fingers, the scroll rolling to a stop at Elara's feet. It was not an act of defeat, but one of release. Her rebellion was over, extinguished not by force, but by a truth too profound to deny. In that moment, she was no longer a villain seeking to break the world, but a lost scholar finally coming home to a reality far more complex and beautiful than any fantasy of control. This surrender was her first, faltering step on a longer path, one that offered not punishment, but the painful, necessary chance for redemption. The complete set of texts was now united, their combined power humming with a gentle, stable light. The story was whole, and so, perhaps, was the possibility of healing for even the most broken of its characters. What does it take for a soul, hardened by resentment, to finally choose to lay down its arms and simply listen? The rain of starlight washed the violence from the air, leaving behind a silence thick with revelation. Across the fractured amphitheater, the Conclave wardens stood frozen, their humming staffs now dark and inert at their sides. They had come to enforce a single, perfect truth, but the sky itself had just shown them a history rich with contradiction and heartbreak. The authority that had once pulsed through their armor, through their very purpose, simply evaporated. A senior warden slowly removed his helmet, his face a canvas of shattered certainty, as he stared at the fading constellations above. There was no enemy left to fight, only a truth so vast it made their old mission seem like a childish fantasy. Their orderly world had been dismantled not by a rebel's blade, but by a story too beautiful and terrible to deny. Elara knelt on the cold stone, her hands resting on the complete set of scrolls. Her throat was raw, her body a hollow shell of exhaustion, but the deepest ache was the fresh, sharp grief for Kael. His sacrifice had purified the ritual, and his absence now filled the space where her triumph should have been. She looked from his still form to the gathered, bewildered wardens, and then to the fallen Morwen. A single, clear thought cut through her sorrow. To lock this knowledge away again, to guard it in another hidden archive, would be to betray everything Kael had died for. It would make her no better than the Conclave, a gatekeeper of truth instead of its guardian. With a resolve that felt both terrifying and inevitable, she made her choice. She would not hoard the texts. She would copy them. She gathered the scrolls, her movements deliberate and reverent, and walked toward the scriptorium chambers built into the amphitheater's lower levels. She ignored the priceless inks and virgin vellum reserved for conclave decrees. Instead, she found simple materials, the kind used by everyday scribes. She would not create a single, perfect master copy to be worshipped. She would make dozens, then hundreds, of imperfect duplicates. She would teach others to do the same. Her first act as the keeper of the world's true history would not be one of secrecy, but of radical, deliberate sharing. In that quiet decision, a new lineage was born. Elara was no longer a scholar who had uncovered a secret. She was becoming the first scrollmaker of a new age, one whose purpose was not to hide the truth, but to set it free, allowing it to grow and change in the hearts and minds of all who were ready to listen. What world will take shape when its foundation is not a single, unyielding stone, but a living, breathing story shared by all? The amphitheater's scriptorium was no longer a place for copying approved texts. Under Elara's direction, its doors were thrown open to anyone with a curious mind and a willing hand. The first scroll she inscribed was not a history of the Valar, but a simple record of Kael's life and his final sacrifice. Written on coarse, common parchment with ink, she mixed herself for mountain berries and soot. This act was her declaration. The old ways of hoarding knowledge in guarded archives were finished. She was building something new, an open library where the complete, unvarnished story of the divine was available for all to read, debate, and even question. The very act of writing itself became a form of healing, a quiet rebellion that honored her friend's memory more than any locked-away relic ever could. Yet, in the peaceful moments between organizing texts and teaching new scribes, the weight of her losses settled deep in her bones. She carried the ghost of Kael's smile and the echo of Morwen's broken spirit. Her hope for this new world was a fragile thing, tempered by the profound cost of the truth it was built upon. How do you build a future when its foundation is paved with the memory of those who fell to give it life? The work of copying the scrolls was a quiet balm on her grieving spirit. But Elara found her eyes drifting off into the distant, unmarked horizon. The history they had recovered was vast, yet it felt like a single, completed chapter in a library that stretched into infinity. The Valar's story, as they now knew it, contained deliberate gaps, moments where the narrative thread frayed and hinted at truths even more profound and unsettling. These were not secrets of imperfection, but mysteries of intent, of choices made in realms beyond mortal comprehension. The immediate battle was won, but the war for understanding had only just begun. She felt this not as a burden, but as a calling. Her purpose had transformed once more. She would continue the search, but no longer from the shadows. She would lead expeditions, not raids. She would train new seekers, not solitary rebels. The woman who had once crept through a forbidden archive in terror was now determined to walk openly into the unknown, a lantern held high not to expose an enemy, but to illuminate a path for others. This decision brought a deep, resonant closure to her personal journey. It was the final, peaceful acceptance of her role, not as a keeper of a finished truth, but as a guide in an endless, wondrous discovery. The world now knew the Valar were flawed, but what sublime and terrifying music might still be waiting in the silence, in the verses of their story that remain unsung. The clear night sky felt like a vast open page, its silence a stark contrast to the war of words that had so recently torn it apart. Elara stood in the center of the amphitheater, the complete set of scrolls a solid, reassuring weight in her arms. They were no longer just parchment and ink, but a testament to sacrifice, a physical anchor to the friend she had lost and the world she had helped save. The air itself seemed different, charged not with the threat of ancient magic, but with the quiet hum of a new beginning. The perfect, distant gods of the Conclave were gone, their statuesque forms shattered by the revelation of their profound and very real struggles. In their place stood the Valar as they truly were, architects of a masterpiece they loved enough to risk their own perfection for. Their story, now one of heartbreaking choices, and a love deep enough to embrace fallibility. This was not a diminished truth, but a far richer one, a foundation built not on the brittle stone of myth, but on the resilient ground of shared experience. And Elara, the woman who had begun this journey seeking a single, definitive answer in a forbidden archive, found that her own quest had reached its end, only to reveal a new and more beautiful path. The frantic seeker of answers was gone, her hunger for a final, closed truth, satisfied by the discovery that the greatest wisdom lies not in possessing all the answers, but in cherishing the questions themselves. Her peace was not found in an ending, but in the acceptance of an endless beginning. She was no longer a rebel or a thief. She was a guardian, a keeper of the flame of inquiry, her purpose now to tend the light so others could find their own way through the mysteries that remain. In restoring the world's true history, she had found her own true calling, a resolution that wove her personal healing into the very fabric of a world, learning to embrace its own beautifully broken, and now honestly remembered, soul. How do you measure a life well lived, if not by the depth of the questions you leave for others to explore?